This meeting to come to order today is Tuesday, November 21st, 2017. This is a study session of the Prescott City Council. Roll call, please.
Mayor Oberg.
Here.
Mayor Pro Tem Lamerson.
Here.
Councilman Blair.
Yes.
Councilman Lizelle.
Here.
Councilwoman Orr.
Here.
Councilman Sischka.
Here.
And Councilwoman Wilcox will not be attending today.
Okay, thank you. Stand for the Pledge of Allegiance, led by Councilman Lizelle.
Please join me in the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
First of all, I want to thank everybody for coming in today. This is the, looks like the fifth study session we've had on the Deep Well Ranch. And I notice there's a reduced number here than normal, and I'm sure that's probably because of the Thanksgiving holiday, and people have already left. I've had a number of people already indicate to me that they plan to be here, but they were already heading out of state for family activities, so they're not here today. I think what I like to do is start out with a quick discussion, and I think one of the things that we need to look at today is, and I remember Councilman Lizelle some time ago saying, you know, is this something we even want to talk about right now with this council, because it is complex and it's going to take a while, and maybe it'd be best for the next council to be the ones that actually make a decision on this. I thought at the time that it would be good for us to continue the discussions, try and work through the issues, and I think we've made great progress on that. I think the city has stepped up and tried to help and make sure things got moving. And I know that the owner developer has moved along and been very gracious in trying to work with us and reach agreement. So we've had a study session for 30 minutes on 11 July. We had a 2-hour study session on 31 October, 7 November, and 14 November it was 1 hour. And public comment was postponed basically because we kind of overextended ourselves that day and put more on the schedule than we could get done. And I eliminated the public comment. And I apologize for that, and we're going to try and make it up today. In the meantime, we've had 2 executive sessions, each with 2 hours. We had one council person that was not there, and the other one was there for a portion of the discussions. And of course, we have the study session again today. So eventually we'll have about 5 study sessions on this, but I still think that what we're probably dealing with is a bridge too far. And I'm not sure that this is wise to bring this up on the 28th, because we've received a lot of documentation yesterday, and I know I haven't had a chance to read it. And we have received about a 40, 50-page document, development agreement, which we have read through and discussed and provided our thoughts on it and changes. We just now received the revised master plan dated 15 November, which has probably a lot of the improved changes in it based on all the discussions with the city staff and the developer. We have 9 documents have been added to the general development standards. Originally, that was noted as additions to the master plan. We now call them general development standards. They're part of Appendix F. There's probably several hundred pages there. We got the master reports for the Deep Well Ranch Master Plan and the Deep Well Ranch Master Plan Memorandum, and I think there was at least 4 master reports. So we received quite a few documents in the last few days, basically yesterday and today, and I don't think anybody here has had a chance to read all these documents. Anybody's read them all?
Not all.
Okay. I know that some of the ones that I've read, that I've seen some questions and concerns in them, and I think not to abrogate our responsibility to the public, it's incumbent upon us to go ahead and look these documents over, fully understand them and make sure that as we move forward, all of our questions and concerns are answered. And I don't see that being done between now and the 28th. I don't think we would be fair and honest with the public if we were to not do our due diligence and read this and take appropriate actions. I'm not blaming anyone, I can tell you that. Maybe there's a little bit of blame on all sides, but obviously this is a very complex subject, and I think we need to make sure we do it right. We're going to be basically obligating all future councils with this agreement, and I think if we're going to do that, we need to make sure we do it right, and we do it to support the public's concerns also. Just out of curiosity, how many people in the public have had a chance to read any of these documents I just listed? One person. Well, I expect you to. You wrote them. Okay, it looks like a couple of people out there. How many people would like to be able to have an opportunity to review these documents and understand what they say and bring your concerns into the council?
Online.
City Manager, I think they're all online now, right?
They are. George, could you share with the audience and council where these are in terms of public consumption?
So the easiest way to get to the information is to go to the City of Prescott's main web page. On the front of the page, on the right-hand side, there are a series of boxes. One of those says Deepwell Ranch Plans and Information. Click on that. It takes you to a page. All of the information is either there or it's linked from there to the location where it's existing. So City of Prescott's main web page, right-hand side, there are a series of boxes. One of them says Deepwell.
What's the address?
City of Prescott. City of Prescott.
That's it? .org?
.gov.
.gov.
Thank you.
So I think what we're going to do today is we're going to continue the study session for 2 hours. I'm going to try and give at least 30 minutes, if not more, to the public to provide their concerns. If you would like to speak, there's going to be a sign-up sheet at the back. I guess we got one back there, right? And if you would like to speak today on any subject that related to Deep Well, then make sure you sign up, and we'll call you up as we have an opportunity. So with that, we'll move on into the discussion of Deep Well Ranch.
Mr. Mayor, can I make a comment?
Yeah, go ahead.
Thank you. Well, I just want to assure you that I have read all of the documents except these documents that are in front of us. First time I've seen them. But I'm sure these are just revisions. And so it's not like we haven't seen what's in these two documents here. And I'll assure you I will read all of them before the 28th. And I'll assure everyone in the audience that I will as well.
Okay, good.
So I just think it's really important that we press on with what our goal was, which was to have this on the agenda for the 28th.
Okay, I'm not sure that was a goal, but obviously, we did go ahead and put a public announcement in the paper in the event that this was to come before the council. So,
Thank you.
yeah, that's fine. Go ahead. Let's start with the discussion.
So, Mr. Mayor, we had several items that we were proposing to discuss today, one of which was a possible presentation by Mr. Chamberlain. That's still open if council would like to hear from him. I believe he's here. It was specifically just to talk about conceptual lot layouts that could happen up there. It's very conceptual. I'm not sure it will help you in the decision-making process, but I leave that between council and Mr. Chamberlain.
Yeah, I asked Mr. Chamberlain if, as we went through, if there was questions, if he would be willing to answer them. He said he would.
So we'll pass that on. The next step, there were some questions about whether or not you wanted to hear additional information from our airport, interim airport director. If that's the case, we have her available to talk to you now. If not, we can cover that during the rest of the presentation following the DA discussion. If that's acceptable to you to wait for that, then we would start with the DA discussion, as that's the primary topic for today's meeting.
I think I'd like to go ahead and give Jesse Baker an opportunity. I think we kind of shortchanged you last time. We gave you 5 minutes, and I know you rushed through it. And we had a pretty extensive document that you gave us with some concerns. And maybe you could just go ahead and relate those concerns very quickly. And as we go into the development agreement, we can see if they've been properly addressed.
Sure. So I did get. I'm going to break this. Sorry. So I did provide council a document that went over all of the areas in which we looked at. This was provided to the Planning and Zoning Commission. There were some things that were addressed, specifically the water restrictions at the end of the runway. That's been addressed as to ensure that we're not attracting wildlife and birds. Birds and airplanes definitely do not mix. So those are things that it was provided to P&Z, and Mr. Barger and I have worked through some of these issues that you see here. I provided this to Planning and Zoning at their request, and then also to you to make sure, and this is for future concerns as well, as we talk about future developments, because we do know that's really the only place to go is near the airport and to encroach on the airport. I think it was important to relay similar what we will look at every time that a development comes to the airport for our review. So the same methodology, the same, it will apply to all developments, and those will be the concerns from the airport each and every time that a development comes. So a lot of this information was more than probably what you needed to make a decision regarding the master plan. It concerned the development that, regardless of your vote, is going to happen in one way or another. It's just a matter of if it's going to happen with the zoning currently in place, or if we use the master plan in order to get that. So that's really more than probably what you need, but I wanted to give you the full scope of how we analyzed the master plan and how we will analyze every development that comes to our plate. So specifically to the information that you really wanted to know, which I addressed last time, was does it meet FAA requirements? And that answer is yes. Because we're in the airport master plan process, I got with Mr. Barger, and we really came up with a way to be more conservative because we don't know what we're going to get within the next 20, 40 years. So we have a fleet mix in the airport master plan. That's, I believe, the CRJ. It's a regional jet. That's what we are designing to. And all of the airport noise contours that he used fits within that fleet mix. While we don't know for sure how that noise contour is going to play out, I do think that what he used is what we will see very, very closely to our airport master plan that we'll see within the next year. So that should answer a lot of your concerns, is does it meet FAA requirements? Are we on the same page with their planning document and our planning document? While I think some things may be, a little bit off here and there, I think generally speaking, we hit the mark. So hopefully that answers your questions as far as FAA requirements. What I really wanted to analyze was what are the consultants asking for, and what are we faced with if we don't do it with the master plan. The big change, actually really the only change from current zoning to the master plan is a section in Zone 3. If you remember the airport impact zones, they have nothing to do with noise, purely safety zones. It is just more likely that an airplane could experience an incident or an accident in those zones. So straight off the runway and then off to the sides of the runway in a conical shape. Those are really the points in which a pilot may have to make a decision on where to land. This was the main thing that I tried to focus on, because the current zoning, when we went back and I really had to learn how to read their master plan with the land use groups. I mean, there was some training involved in that because it was complicated. So your decision has to do with current zoning. Really anything in light industrial could go in those zones. That's 3,000 feet, that something could get closer to the airport. That buildings, manufacturing facilities, school, dormitories, all of that could be within that zones 1, 2, and 3. what they're offering is open-like space. It's not completely open space, but it is things like baseball fields. And I can tell you from a pilot's perspective, they're going to want to look first for a place to land, and preferably it's not going to be on top of a building. So those kind of spaces are very valuable to the airport. And so my recommendation was either to buy that property or to take advantage of an airport master planning process in which we can come to an agreement to get open like space, protect the pilots in the air, and reduce the population in those places as well. Some of the things that we talked to the consultants about were restricting certain buildings like schools. They were proposing schools to be in that building. They took that out. So these were all things that we addressed in the negotiation process that I feel was very beneficial to the city of Prescott and to the airport in protecting. Again, this isn't about, we will see impacts from this development. I tried not to focus that on as a whole. We will see an increase to the airport fund. We will have to hire more employees to do noise mitigation and noise investigation. Those are things that will happen regardless of your vote, just because we're putting housing next to an airport. It's not compatible. But that being said, I would recommend that we take the opportunity to plan what is in those areas and plan to the best of our ability versus rolling the dice and having a large anything goes within these zones and within the zoning guidelines. We don't know what we're going to get. With this master plan, it does give us a little bit of foresight to be able to say we know exactly what can go in zones 1, 2, and 3, baseball fields, open type space, parks, and that would give pilots a place to land. So I do think that that's a major benefit.
Excuse me, Mayor, can I ask
Go ahead.
Jesse a question? What is included in the current zoning industrial light? And maybe the city manager.
Probably a better
can
question for
answer
George,
that.
and I think he's ready to answer that. George, will you point out the 3 land nodes that are IL currently on the wiki?
So on the current map, this is the proposed master plan, just a general area in the immediate vicinity of the end of the runway.
The runway is where?
Right here. So the cone shape that Jesse was just talking about is actually this, and it makes a curve. And if you follow that curve around, it would come into this area and come back towards the airport to form that cone shape that she was talking about. Within that area currently, it's zoned industrial light, and our industrial light zoning district allows most of the uses that we allow in all of our other zoning districts except for direct residential. Single-family, multifamily residential uses are not allowed. Other than those, pretty much anything, including such things as convents, I don't think we have one here yet, electrical generation plants, hospitals, trauma centers, playgrounds, utilities, various types of utility buildings or utility setups. Most of the retail commercial uses are also permitted within that same area, so you would be allowed to have a mini storage is more of an industrial, but if you had a gas station mini market, grocery stores, often general retail stores such as department stores.
There's a couple that are dormitories and daycare centers are available.
The dormitories are generally something that's associated with some other use, but yes, dormitories would be permitted. Daycare centers generally are considered accessory to other uses as well. If you had a manufacturing plant and you employed a full range of age of workers, then you would have that as an accessory use.
So let's look at that versus what they're proposing.
And we're showing what's being proposed up here.
Yeah.
So generally what would be allowed in that area is civic and open spaces. Civic would allow buildings, generally occupied buildings, but they're usually buildings that are more associated with government operations. Police and fire station, there's an area proposed to be reserved somewhere up in here for just that. Police or a fire station, or a combination of the two. Would also allow government-related buildings. If at some point you wanted to have a city hall annex out there, that would fall under the civic uses. Libraries, library annexes would fall under the civic uses. The use that's designated in the land use table that's proposed for their master plan says that they will have at least 50% of that as open space. And then the remainder could be either open space or civic space. So there's a possibility that you could have a lot of open space. That open space could be playing fields. It could be considered parking areas because there are no structures in them. And it's within a reasonable approach to consider that a parking lot is safer in an impact zone than a building with people in it. The ball field concept is something that they've talked about. They've talked several times about a school site potentially up here with its ball fields within that impact zone. So this area is outside of that impact zone 3, which is the primary point of contention. That removes a large area of playgrounds and things like that from the school into this other zone. So the buildings with the children in them, or the adults in them, depending on the type of school, is outside the impact zone. The play areas, the fields are within the impact zone. The one area that's different, that is slightly different than our current zoning and would allow uses that the current zoning wouldn't normally allow, is this area. So this area would allow for a full mix of uses, commercial, retail, perhaps some industrial if that were something that were appropriate, but it would also allow residential if it's part of a mixed use complex. It has to be mixed with a commercial designation. So really the only area that allows residential that we don't currently have allowed within the master plan area would be that portion of the property. And again, its primary purpose and likely its initial purpose would be for commercial uses simply because of its location. That's one of the two high-value locations for commercial to locate within this development. The other is just south across the street down here. So these are their two hot points where they have the most traffic volume and the most access into the property. You have a roundabout that's already planned for this location. They are requesting through a process that the city has established called a traffic impact analysis to have another street here with potentially a signalized intersection, but there are other options as well for that location. Both of those provide the things that they need for commercial uses. I would expect to see commercial development there before most residential. What you may see, though, are an apartment type complex, something where it's more of an commercial structure rather than individual single-family homes. They're not proposing single-family homes in this area at all.
Mr. Mayor, if I could. George, so a mixed use, and let me see if I get this right, like a mixed use, for example, as I understand it, would be like downtown, right, currently, Whiskey Row or thereabouts, where somebody would have a condominium or apartment above a retail or a restaurant or whatnot. And the main concern of this mixed use is there'd be used to like a noise factor where somebody bought a condo above one of our saloons and then complained about the music late at night, they kind of knew what they were getting into, that type of thing.
That's a very similar concept to what they've described to us in the past. That is, generally you put commercial on the ground floor.
Lifestyle in
and
the
then
urban setting.
Residential could be above that.
Okay, thank you.
Hopefully that answered the question.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mayor. Thank you, Jesse.
One of your concerns was that the noise contours are 8 years old, based on the master plan that's being currently worked on at the airport. Have those contour lines changed at all?
We haven't gotten that far in the master plan. We'll probably see those contour lines updated within the next 6 months. But that's going back to whenever I first addressed it with Mr. Barger. This document, it definitely was a concern, but over meeting with him, we were able to basically make that a more conservative approach, get with the master plan. They met with our airport master plans consultant, Delta Airport Consultants and Dibble Engineering, both, to ensure that their contours that they were placing in here were going to be like or very, very similar to what was going to be in the airport master plan. It does not take into account any future construction with the airport. We didn't get into that, but only what is happening today and what we likely will see as the fleet mix being able to grow the DNL lines.
And you talk about a 7460-1 and 7460-2
Correct.
be filed with the FAA and approval received. Is that in the development agreement?
I don't believe that it would need to be, and I wasn't in the development agreement meetings. However, that's standard practice. It's a federal requirement, so you would have to do that. Anybody who comes and develops near the airport has to go through that.
Okay,
And
so
we address that in the pre-application committee.
that's on autopilot. We don't need to worry about it?
No, we as the airport entity double check that. We receive those filings from the FAA, or I do.
Obviously, you've seen the abrogation agreement that the city has, and you feel that that's sufficient?
I do. The one I reviewed initially, the first copy that I had, I did not, but I found one that Mr. Palladini had placed together, and that's the one that you received today. That one is much better, and I feel protects the city.
Okay. I think you're not too concerned now about the fact that we're going to have standing water or anything?
No, that was taken care of through the P&Z sessions.
And again, the land use, Zone 3, you indicate here in your chart that single residential, multifamily, group homes, convalescent nursing homes, secondary residences are not allowed in Zone 3, and that's impact Zone 3?
That is.
Okay. And caretaker units are 1,200 feet or less. I'm not sure what a caretaker unit is, but, and then on the remainder of zones, 4, 5, and 6, apparently it's permissible, but is not recommended. Is that correct?
That is correct. Well, let me make this clear. The FAA leaves it up to the municipality to make those decisions. Outside of the 65 DNL, the FAA does not restrict what is built outside of basically the airport fence. If you are outside of the 65 DNL, that is where their restrictions come, and then also to the 40-to-1 ratio off of the end of the runway. We have runway safety areas and protection zones that they have addressed. So those are what the FAA requirements are. The impact zones are all recommendations, strong recommendations. It is a strong recommendation that there be no residential anywhere 1 through 6. However, that's not the question that's being asked today. It's the zoning already allows that. So it's really about what we can get as far as open space versus what we have to give up.
Okay. Any other questions, comments from the council? On aviation? Okay. Why don't you go ahead and sit down for a moment? I'll just take any quick comments on the airport from the public. Go ahead. If you got, come on up. If you got a question.
I wanted to get my bearings on the map. I noticed the end of the runway.
Step up to the mic so everybody can hear you.
I noticed the end of the runway, the roundabout. Is that where the Pippin Museum is?
No.
So this is Perkins Drive.
Perkins Drive. Okay.
Right. This roundabout will be constructed in the near future if it's not already under construction.
Any other questions, comments from the public? Okay, let's move on.
So today we're going to talk about the development agreement. I'm going to sort of just call out some of the highlighted areas I think are most critical or most important to be aware of. So first and foremost, in the recitals, recital B is important because I want to just emphasize that, and Jesse sort of made the same comment, that we're not starting from a position of, is the master plan that's being proposed better than nothing on this property? We have current zoning, and the pre-annexation agreements that are referred to in Exhibit B are what give a contractual right to the Deepwell Ranch folks the rights to water and sewer. So we're starting from a standpoint of there's zoning on the property, and they have a right to roughly 800 and something feet remaining of water and the concurrent sewer that would go with it. So that's kind of our starting point, and that's what Exhibit B talks about.
John, if I may,
Okay.
we're also talking about the 1,800 acres, am I
We're
correct?
talking about the 1,800 acres, which
Not
is
talking about 8,000 or 20,000 or any other damn thing. We're talking about the 1,800 acres
right. So when you-
specifically.
when the agreement, when the development agreement talks about the property, it talks about 1,800 acres. That's what we're talking about when we talk about the property. So I wanted to get to, I think some of the primary concerns that folks had is that the city was abrogating its authority when it comes to this development, and that's not the case here. What's going to govern this property, and this is in the development agreement and the master plan, what's going to govern this property is if the zoning, if the SPC zoning is approved, a fundamental part of that zoning is a master plan must be approved with that. The SPC zoning in and of itself doesn't do anything. It doesn't really allow for any particular use. It mandates that a master plan must be adopted along with that or as part of the rezoning. So the rezoning is technically it's to SPC, but the practical answer is that what the zoning is the master plan, and you all have a copy of that. So when you look at the master plan, that tells us what the land uses are and what some of the development requirements are. When it comes to regulation of development, I want to make this real clear that the development is regulated by all of the city codes, all of the land development code, all of the rules and regulations, procedures that the city has, unless it's specifically modified by the master plan or by the development agreement. So the mayor mentioned earlier what's called Exhibit F development standards. Those are basically the development standards for public infrastructure that the developer is going to be required to build. The city has what's called the general engineering standards. Those general engineering standards govern how infrastructure is built by a developer and then conveyed over to the city. The reason we have those general engineering standards is to make sure we get a consistent quality of public infrastructure that the city ultimately takes over. There is a process in the general engineering standards to modify or alter those standards, and that's available to any development, any developer, and because the intent of those general engineering standards was to be flexible. As you recall, I think when you approved these a year or so ago, there was a very strong impetus to make sure that those standards were flexible. So when you look at those Exhibit F documents that were online and that you had yesterday, that the public works staff, community development staff have signed off on, have agreed to, those are essentially upfront agreements to modify or alter some of those general engineering standards. This all goes to the discussions we've had from last week where there were something like 400 and something points of disagreement between what was being proposed and what our engineering and public works staff were at. Those were essentially resolved to no more points of disagreement, and that's that Exhibit F document. So we're talking about the development of the property or the regulations of the property. The city code regulates it, the land development code regulates it, the master plan, to the extent there are, only to the extent that there are modifications to land development code standards, the master plan would control. Only to the extent that that Exhibit F development standards is modified or altered, that's where you're going to see those alterations to the general engineering standards. So both, because I think it's important to note that there's sort of this perception out there that this is going to be completely free from any city rules and regulations, and nothing could be farther from the truth. There are a limited number of exceptions or modifications or alterations, and that's what governs the regulation, or that's what regulates the development of the property. And then there are other items that regulate the property included in these government requirements or governing requirements. Any changes to the city code that are basically police powers, health, safety, welfare, would apply to the property. Any updates to the building codes or health and safety codes would also govern development of the property. So if this development pulls building permits a year from now, and then 10 years from now, the building code has changed, the new building code would regulate that new development.
John,
Yes.
real quick, just to clarify that. So we adopt new codes as a city, 2018, 2020, new international codes. In that code says it needs about 30% more hold downs in a structure. They have to abide by that.
Right.
But if a legislative body says, for some reason, we want all red roofs in Prescott, you can only use red shingles, that would not apply.
Most likely not, because it's not part of, a
I just wanted to discern the difference
right.
between aesthetics and actual life safety.
Correct. And so one of the concessions we did reach with the developer is originally they wanted to freeze the general engineering standards as modified to what we have today. What we agreed to was that either the developer could agree to the changes to general engineering standards, or that we could impose those without agreement so long as the cost difference between the standards didn't increase the cost of that infrastructure by more than 10%. And again, our public works staff, agreed that was a reasonable number. And the reason for that is the concern that in some places, that state to the west that we won't speak its name, they used engineering standards to create moratoria. By just imposing these outrageous sort of materials or construction methods, and essentially it makes it impossible to develop because it's cost prohibitive. It's not a moratorium per se, but it acts as one. So that was the developer's concern, and so we reached resolution on that. And then obviously any future updates to the city code that are again, those regulatory type requirements, those would apply. And then any changes to our taxes, fees, review fees, inspection fees, development impact fees, as long as they're applied in a non-discriminatory manner, those would apply too. So I just want to make that clear, because I think that's an important issue. There's another.
John, could I ask you a
Yes.
question? When you talk about general engineering standards,
Mm-hmm.
Are you saying that they're a minimum?
Yes.
Okay.
They are a minimum standard of for infrastructure that's built by development that's intended to be public infrastructure and ultimately conveyed over to the city.
And so 10 years from now, if in fact we change those, the standards are changed, it's not that everybody has to go back and redo their buildings that have already been developed, right?
Correct. It's only prospective. It's going
Okay.
forward. Right. Yeah. We can't require retrofitting of existing, because we don't do that ourselves. We have, water and sewer lines downtown here that are 50, 60 years old. So we impose the general engineering standards. If the city's going to do a public works project, we abide by our own standards as well. So it's nothing. We're not imposing any higher standards on development than we wouldn't impose on ourselves in terms of quality or materials, those kinds of things.
You want to talk about additional property?
Yes, we can get there. So in section 2.4, this is another agreement we were able to reach, and just kind of backing up slightly, we spent, I think, 4 multi-hour meetings negotiating this with the developer and owner, working out these issues over the last month or so, in addition to a tremendous amount of staff time from all of the departments in terms of going through this and making sure that we tried to get the best agreement we could get to, understanding that when you negotiate an agreement, you can't always get everything, but you try and get the best deal you can get in this context. So if additional property, right now we're talking about 1,800 acres. If the owner wants to add property to this development, it has to go through an annexation process, which is a legislative process. It has to go through basically a rezoning process to add it to the master plan. And then if those two things happen, then it's automatically added to the development agreement automatically includes that property. So there are two significantly discretionary decisions that the city council ultimately would have to make to add property to this 1,800 acres. Annexation and essentially a rezoning from whatever the annexed property would have out in the county or the state trust land, for instance.
Mayor Pro Tem has a comment.
Thank you. That's only subject to if it's annexed, though. The property that's sitting out there today that's adjacent, this agreement that we're negotiating is not really relevant to that property.
Right. This,
Only relevant to the 1,800 acres that we're talking about.
exactly.
And if we're solicited, or if we solicit them that we would like to change something, at that point, something else takes place, right?
We have to go through, any attempt at adding property that's not in this 1,800 acres would have to go through an annexation and would have to go through a rezoning, which, as we know, are significant public processes, planning commission, city council, significant staff time. Only after those, if after those two things are approved, would then this development agreement be automatically placed, affecting those properties. So there's a significant amount of, again, opportunity for staff review, council, planning commission, and public input before any property is added to this 1,800 acres. Okay. Phasing, just want to point this out, that infrastructure inside the property, inside the 1,800 acres, and some of it outside is built by the development. Development pays its way. Growth pays for growth, however you want to call it. It's going to be done just like the private development portion, the housing, the commercial, whatever, gets built in phases. The infrastructure gets built in phases to serve that private development. And again, that's the way the city would develop infrastructure in phases as needed when it's not being built by development. Maximum number of dwelling units. This is a change. I want to point this out. George, help me out here. Switch it over. All right, so I want to point this out that, there you go. So the maximum number of dwelling units is allowed in the master plan is 10,500. And we've gone through that, I think, that discussion in significant detail over the last 4 or 5 study sessions. What this does, though, it says that notwithstanding that 10,500, that the developer owner acknowledge that the available water is what really governs how many units can be built out there. So right now, and that goes back to that pre-annexation agreement. So right now there are 800 and something acre feet of water available to the property by way of those pre-annexation agreements. That's what's going to govern how much gets developed out there. Unless either A, the big Chino gets built, or B, the owner or developer can bring other water from somewhere to get credits for, the current 800 and something acre feet is what's really going to control the amount of development out there. So I think that's important.
John, I think it's also important with regards to the fact that we own the water that belongs to the city of Prescott out in the Big Chino. The agreement between the Deep Well Ranch and the city of Prescott doesn't give all the water in the Big Chino to the Deep Well Ranch. That was also negotiated out.
Right.
So there's a significant, I don't want to use the word restriction because I don't like those words, but there's a significant limitation based on the amount of water that's been negotiated out.
Yeah, that Part 2 or whatever, that Part 2 water right, again, I'll use if, the Big Chino's ever built, I think allots another like 900 or 950 acre feet of water to the deep well, the deep well property. And so it's not an unlimited amount of water. So again, 10,500 dwelling units is your cap. But that's then is governed, how you get there is really governed by how much water is available and when. Can I switch back? George, thank you. All right. Okay. So another thing I wanted to point out is on page 9 there, when we talk about these master reports. These master reports are your traffic, well, it's all up there. Traffic, water, wastewater, drainage. These are conceptual reports because, again, these reports have they been reviewed by your public works staff and been signed off on? And what these reports do is say, as a concept, as this master plan concept, this is the type of transportation needs there are, this is the type of drainage, this is the type of wastewater, this is the type of water infrastructures are going to be needed. As property is then taken down to specifically plan and develop, subdivision planning, site planning, then every one of those then requires a specific infrastructure report that goes along with that specific development. Because the only time or you can do a traffic impact analysis, for instance, that really means something is when you start doing subdivision planning. Then you know how many lots there are, how many people there are, how many cars there are, or if you have commercial, whether there's traffic lights needed, whether a roundabout works, how much parking is needed, those kinds of things. So this is it's sort of a focus. You start off broad and you start focusing down, and that's what the infrastructure reports will do over time as you start drilling down and start taking down pieces of the property and develop. So all of those, again, are governed. The process by which is governed in the master plan, and those infrastructure reports will then tell you or tell us precisely what kind of infrastructure is needed, how wide, how many lanes on a road, how big the pipe should be, how much parking there needs to be, what kind of drainage needs to happen, but done in a broad context, so that when you're done with the development, it's not, the infrastructure is built cohesively and comprehensively and not piecemeal. And in the past, we've seen where, for instance, drainage is done piece by piece and part by part. And when you get done with the developing, all of a sudden we realize, well, the drainage isn't sufficient. And then usually what happens is the city has to go back in, perhaps with some funding from the flood control district, and redo drainage. So this helps us avoid that kind of retrofitting at the end.
I've got a comment on these master reports for a moment. Like you said, grading, drainage, transportation, water, and wastewater. And I know I've had a lot of comments from the public on transportation, and might behoove many of you to take an opportunity to look at that online. There was a couple things that I saw in it that I thought were kind of unusual. I think the demographic for the Prescott area between 2016 and 2040, it indicates we're only going to go up 3,800 people. I believe it's a little bit laughable, isn't it? Tom, how many permits do we have this year? Something like 350?
Yes, Mayor, Council, this last fiscal year, right around 358, 360, single family.
So if you look at 2 people per home, that's 700, and that's in 1 year. So it looks like this number is way off. And, I do know that there's a chart in here. It looks like it's a SIMPO chart. Again, I don't know how old these numbers are. They go back to 2010 and then project out to 2040. And in one area, they got 12,000 cars approximately in 2010 and 50,000 in 2040. But, you saw the article in the paper that showed they're going to have about 16,000 homes out there. I just talked to Mayor Skoog the other day, and he said in the North Granville area, Viewpoint, I can't remember what the name of the other areas, I think it was called Jasper or something like that. He's talking about another 35 homes, so you're talking about 20,000 homes in that area up there. So, I think it behooves us to do a independent traffic study pretty quickly on this area and determine exactly what kind of impact we're going to have with that kind of density of homes up there over the next 40 to 50 years. And I would just ask everybody that in the future, if you get a chance and come in for another study session on this, that you have an opportunity to look at that and bring your questions with you. Thank you.
Okay, so I'm going to skip a little bit ahead. We were able to get this agreement yesterday. And so in talking about doing a multi-jurisdictional or regional traffic analyses, which obviously would include, the city, Prescott Valley, Chino Valley, the county, SIMPO, it should also rightfully include contributions from development. And so the Chamberlain Group agreed that it would participate in this study and try and help offset the cost based on its proportionate share. In other words, what the deep well as a whole may contribute to the regional traffic issue up to $20,000. So I think we're satisfied with that, simply because it's hard to know right now, what the scope of this type of regional study would look like. But it's something that we're going to work on with the other jurisdictions and other prospective developers going forward to make sure that, we have this sort of comprehensive look at the North Prescott area in terms of how, not only what the traffic impacts are going to be, but what the potential solutions would be to some of those traffic issues. So,
Councilwoman Orr.
Yes, Mayor, I'd just like to also make the comment that this report was adopted by SIMPO in 2015, I believe. And the same report shows that State Route 89A, Pioneer Parkway, we're going to see traffic at 2040 at 81,000. That's a projection.
cool.
Right.
What year?
2040.
2040.
And in 2010, it was 25,000. So it does show definitely almost a 4 times projection. So I'm wondering if this is a typo on that next page. I'm going to look into that because that doesn't seem right.
Yeah. He's talking about demographics?
Yes, I think that's wrong. I know that's wrong. So.
Okay, moving forward, I just want another call out is.
Let's go back to 10 for a second.
Okay.
In the right-of-way and easements, there was a stipulation down here, the city acknowledges and agrees that the commercial center described in the master plan, and it goes on to talk about that. Again, we brought this up some time ago about whether or not we should be obligating the city and future councils. I see nothing wrong with this saying that the owner-developer acknowledges and agrees, but I'm not certain that the city, that we should go ahead and say that the city acknowledges and agrees this, because I can't state that what I'm seeing here is true or not. So I know I couldn't agree to that statement, so I think that needs to be changed.
It's this where this section here, I'm sorry about that, which is a preamble to what the city is would actually agree to, which is A, work reasonably with whatever government entity to lower the sound wall on the parkway adjacent to the property. And that is a sound wall that my understanding is Mr. James actually requested that sound wall be built to its current height because there was an anticipation that residential would go there. And now that if commercial goes there, that sound wall is no longer necessary. So that's county. So our obligation under this provision would be just to reasonably work with the county to see if they were willing to lower the sound wall. It wouldn't obligate us to actually undertake any construction or do any, spend any money. It's just a matter of getting the sound wall. If the county concedes or consents to that, then that cost would most likely be passed on to the development for the cost of doing that. The other thing it would do is this: provide reasonable commercial access to the property if justified by a traffic impact analysis. So again, this is that access to the property from 89 and Willow Creek Road it's driven by engineering. It's driven by traffic impact analysis that says, what kind of traffic does the development generate? What kind of access does the development need? And from really kind of, I think, three perspectives. First is safety, obviously. Second is space or area, because obviously there are limitations on what you can do given the amount of room you have to do it. Sometimes, and that's why you remember last week when Ian Mattingly was here, he was talking about sort of drawing lines, particularly at the Parkway and Willow Creek, to make sure that development didn't encroach in those corners so there was sufficient space to put in access to and from the Parkway. And the third is what's called, as I think you call it, service level. As you know, and I'm talking like an engineer and I hate it, but service level is that grading, like school grading, not road grading. We're A through F, so an A service level is a great performing street, and F is a failure. So it's going to look at those traffic impact analyses. Will look at primarily those three things, or at least that will drive what kind of access is appropriate and fitting for that commercial development in that Parkway 89 kind of corner there. So that's what that does. To me, that preamble language, if the developer's willing to remove it, I don't think it changes.
No, it doesn't. I think we can give reasonable accommodations without that statement being in there. I fully agree with you. And I agree also that, I like the fact that there's a traffic analysis, impact analysis done here. Obviously, 89 is a major arterial. We don't want to slow that down. We want to keep that high speed for people coming out of Chino, coming into work here in Prescott. And so hopefully, as we move forward on this, we'll keep it that way and don't allow stoplights or things in there that would cause the flow of traffic there to be greatly reduced and start to cause an impact. And so I think we can definitely accommodate this without having that preamble in it, because I disagree with the preamble. I think we're obligating future councils that they agree to this too, and I'm not sure that they would agree with it. That's all I'm saying.
I think, did I mention 11, the warranty? Recently, we've changed our warranty requests, and this just represents that we get 2-year warranty on public infrastructure once we accept it. So any defects in the public infrastructure, that once we accept it, we have a 2-year warranty where the developer has to go back and repair or replace to the extent there are defects in the design or construction. On page 12, I think I want to point out transportation. I want to show you another change. 1, 2. Okay.
Is there any way you could zoom in on that?
You're asking a whole heck of a lot from me. There. Wow. Okay. So I think the most important thing about this particular provision is that originally the developer was going to be required to construct or, for the construct or, arrange for the construction of all the transportation needs, and it said within the development, meaning the 1,800 acres. Now, we all know that that this development will create some transportation roadway that's perhaps outside the development. So what this change does is it clearly allocates that to the extent there's transportation street type construction necessary outside of the 1,800 acres, that to the extent that the proportionate share of that those improvements are necessitated by this development, the developer pays for that, either by, by doing the work or by reimbursing the city. So I think this is a good.
And their pro rata share.
Yes, pro rata share. We can only, just to be clear, we can't demand more than a proportionate share be paid by development. It's called an exaction, and we're legally limited to what the demand is or created by the development, and that's what we can make development pay in terms of growth, paying for growth. Can't have development pay for inadequate infrastructure if it already exists prior to development, for instance. A couple of points, I want to point these out when it comes to landscaping, multi-use paths, bike paths and parks and open space. If the developer builds landscaping in the right-of-way, builds multi-purpose paths, builds trails, builds parks, bicycle lanes, those kinds of things. And those are dedicated then or conveyed over to the city. They become public infrastructure. To the extent the developer builds them to our standard, then the city agrees to maintain that just like it does every other park, street, sidewalk, trail, whatever. If the developer decides it wants to do more than the standard, and particularly when it comes to streets and roads, if the developer essentially adds landscaping, then that marginal increase in cost is paid for by development. So it does it. So when you add streets and parks and bike paths and those kinds of things to our inventory of infrastructure, it ultimately becomes the city's responsibility for operational cost, but only to the extent it meets our standard. If it exceeds the standard, then that marginal increase is paid for by development. I'll point out there is a potential for private streets to be done, to be developed within the property. To the extent there are private streets, the city does not assume the obligation for maintenance of those private streets, but at the same time has access for public safety and then underground utilities and those kinds of things. So to the extent they want to have there are portions that have gated streets, for instance, the private homeowner association or developer is obligated to maintain those. I want to point out, so there's water infrastructure and wastewater infrastructure that's going to be built outside of the development, servicing the development. And I'll scroll back to the very top of the document. These should have actually followed. So this map shows wastewater infrastructure that is essentially outside of the development, even though you can see a line, the dotted line, for instance, crossing the park property, and in the same way, water. These are projects that the city would build and then would be reimbursed by way of development impact fees to the extent though this type of infrastructure is needed or is necessitated by the development. So for instance, if these lines are not necessary but for the development, so 100% of the cost is attributable to the development, then by way of what's called an infrastructure improvement plan, would determine that 100% of the cost is allocated to the property, and development impact fees would eventually pay for the cost of this infrastructure. Same with water and wastewater. So again, development pays its own way, growth pays for growth, even though there may be times where the city builds things as part of a capital improvement project or plan. That doesn't mean that it's coming out of our monthly fees or general fund taxes, a general fund, or streets and road, sales tax. If it's necessitated by development, to the extent it is necessitated by development, development pays its way. Another thing that's been offered, and George earlier showed you, they've offered up the developers offered up a portion of the property for a public safety, fire station, police substation on the property, and I think it was shown to you on the map. That would be available for the city to build, again, a public safety station out there. The funding of that could come from development impact fees, at least to the extent, again, necessitated by this development, could come from what's called a community facilities district. But, you know, this is one of those sort of public infrastructure needs that is not 100% attributable to a deep well, you know, the deep well development. It would serve Pinion Oaks and a large part of North Prescott that's already developed. So part of that would have to come from other sort of general funding sources other than impact fees or community facilities district. And again, it's all part of the analysis that gets done. To what extent does this development necessitate that improvement? And the same goes for a transit center and trailheads that get built out there. This is important here, this 312, that the owner, again, because this is an agreement between the city and the developer, and the school district's not a party, but this talks about the owner's obligation or to work diligently with the school district, that to the extent they can work a deal with the school district for a campus out there, then the developer or the owners have agreed to do that. Community Facilities District is again, it's a financing tool. It is essentially an extra property tax assessment, but it's only paid for by the properties in the district. So if this Deep Well Ranch, 1,800 acres, becomes a Community Facilities District, and that district is then used to fund or finance infrastructure, there's no cost to anybody outside of the district. So it doesn't impose any cost on people living downtown or people in Pinion Oaks or wherever else, only the property within the district. And it could happen. It's for a future, it's really a future decision that could be made at some point. I wanted to point out, kind of last but not least, I think, this master plan administrator. I think there's, some misconception that this master plan administrator is sort of a independent czar that can do things irrespective of city rules and regulations. Remember, going back to the governing requirements govern the development of the property and the use of the property. The master plan administrator is really intended to be a single point of contact for the city when it comes to dealing with development issues out there. Because as you can imagine, and you've heard, the foundation isn't a developer and can't be a developer. So their intent is to sort of sell off the property, and it could go to a number of different developers. So the master plan administrator is sort of a central point that all the developers have to go through and use in dealing with the city on future issues and future items. So it actually makes the process more efficient because I think it reduces the potential for infighting amongst various owners and developers in that property down the road. So, but just to be clear, the master plan administrator isn't some super governmental entity that can overrule, city rules and regulations in the city code and the master plan. It can't make unilateral changes to the development agreement, can't make unilateral changes to the master plan, can't ignore the law. It's really sort of an administrative type function, not a government type function. And if you look at 21 and 20, those are the things that the master plan administrator can do. One of the key things, I think, by the way, is that, as we all know, the city charges for building permit review and to issue permits and those kinds of things, and we go through our sort of normal processes. To the extent that this development creates a demand greater than what we're able to provide, the master plan administrator can then request the city add either staff, temporary staff, or contractors to help facilitate development of the property, but all that cost for that extra is on the developer and not the taxpayer, not the city. Let's see.
And John,
Yes.
those extra staff would be administrated through the city.
Right.
It wouldn't be
Yeah,
independent.
no, they would be either city contractors or city temporary employees where we would have, I want to say command and control, but that's probably not the
No,
right word.
they-
Oversight.
We would
Yeah,
oversee
yeah,
them.
Yeah, oversight, right. So and obviously they would have to follow all of building codes and make sure that things are done to the code. So a couple of points I want to point out in the amendments. There is an amendment procedure for the master plan, and there's two different amendments. There's a major and a minor. So the major amendments, I think, are significant, and community development staff has said that's a good way to define major amendment. That's basically a rezoning. That requires this whole process, at least to the extent of whatever is trying to be amended, goes through a planning commission, goes through a city council, goes through the public process before any major amendments can happen. Minor amendments are a staff level approval. There are 4 conditions that have to exist before an amendment is deemed a minor amendment. And basically, it has to have a relatively de minimis impact on adjoining properties. Even though, however, a minor amendment is a staff or administrative level review, notice still goes out to adjacent property owners, which is more than what we would do now, for instance, on a lot of minor amendments to things, where adjacent, at a staff level, a lot of times, adjacent property owners aren't even notified. So this is actually an add, I think, then to to what we actually do for a lot of other properties. Because I think this comes out of the concerns that the Planning Commission had, that, because of the complexity of these land use groups, they wanted to be able to provide people notice that if things were going to change, even in a minor way, that neighbors at least would get some type of notice. Also want to point out Exhibit E. This is important. Both the site plan approval process and the subdivision plat approval process are current processes. So there's no, the only thing we kind of agreed to that's a little out of the ordinary is that review of subdivision plats by the city council, not approval, but just review, have to occur within 4 weeks of a planning commission approval. And that's pretty much within our standard operating procedures. This just puts that on paper. So I don't think it's an extra burden on the city. So again, I think there's some perceptions out there that the city was abrogating a lot of its authority. But this process, I think, is really important, because this is where you actually see what's going to get developed. And a lot of this is going to be public. Subdivision plat approval is always public. Much of site plan approval is public. So there is going to be continued public processes, when things actually get proposed to be developed. And that is all I have on the development agreement currently. If you have any questions.
Yeah, let's go back to the recital. We had a question on that. There was some confusion on the council on that. Is that going to be revised or
How about recital C?
Yes.
Recital C remains the same as
Remains
it's
the same
currently,
just the way it is.
it's currently written, right.
Okay.
That issue's been resolved.
All right. Any questions, comments from the council?
I just have one, Mayor. I know that between engineering and community development, and especially your team, John, I don't normally, as you know, in the past 4 years, thank staff because you get paid to do what you're doing. But you have done your homework on this, and I appreciate your work on it.
Yeah, again, I thank the staff. I know they've been maybe I'm approaching thousands of hours on this, and It's gone across the entire organization, everything from the airport, to public works, to community development, to probably police and fire, and obviously the legal department. So I appreciate all this work that everybody's done to try and bring this to fruition and give us a better understanding of where we're going on this thing. So I'm going to take a couple more comments from the council here, and then we'll go to the public. And remember to, if you want to speak, I think there's a sign-up sheet still in the back. Is it up front now? Okay. If you still want to sign up, I guess we'll just have you come on up and sign it up here. You'll be called up. If you do come up, try and limit your comments to about 5 minutes and keep it relative to what we've been discussing here. So, Councilman Blair.
George, I had a question. Relative to density, the 10,500 keeps coming up as a number in the press and everywhere you read. Based upon the city's obligation to water, how many structures would they be, I don't want to use the word allowed, but be obligated or suggested to build under what the first number would be? In other words, the small Chino amount of water in the first development.
I can answer to start with. If you get into more detail, we also have Leslie Grazer here to help with that. So basically, under the new council water policy, if the development is intended to be water efficient, which is what we're pressing all new development to be, 1 acre foot would supply 5 single-family homes. So given that number, if you look down at the second paragraph, the amount of water that's currently available, roughly 800 acre feet at this stage, would allow for an additional 4,000 homes. Any additional homes would need to be supplied through alternative water either brought by the developer or provided to us through a process of like the Big Chino.
George, why don't you go ahead and put this up so everybody can see it?
I think what I'm interested in looking at is single family from my mind thought. So you have 10,500 that keeps coming up as a number. In the first allotment of water, they have 3,993. When the Big Chino comes on board, if you're talking about single family residential, how many would that give them?
That would give them about 6 additional. So again, based on the numbers that we were just looking at, there are 798.6 acre feet available to them that was reserved prior. That number would allow for about 4,000 residential units. And then when you add the additional amounts, it looks to be that number jumps up to about 8,400.
Okay, so let's just call it 8,500. So that is what the city of Prescott is obligated to through water contracts.
That's correct.
Okay, we can't change that. We can't change that. We haven't.
We're obligated at this point. You can't go backwards.
My point is regardless of whether there's a master plan or not a master plan, we are obligated to provide that amount of water.
That's correct.
So,
it's independent of the master plan. That's correct.
Thank you. So the other amount of water would have to come from another source.
Yes.
Meaning buying water credits or whatever the case may be. But that's not something we need to be involved with because we don't have contract to them for that amount.
There is a process in place that would allow them to bring additional water to the table, but it requires action by the city to actually make it available.
Correct.
So that would be something that would occur in the future should they.
But my main point is right now the city of Prescott, as we speak today, on the amount of property that's coming in that's already annexed, it already has zoning, we're obligated to 8,500 single-family structures, thereabouts, roughly, whether it's a master plan or not. So in your opinion, as a professional, a guy with a master's, no doubt, urban planning, long-range planning, is it better to let them build today the way they want to? Or is it better for us to go through the master plan process and make for a better community?
So I'm not going to say anything I haven't said in the last 3 or 4 times that I've been up here. Master planning is preferable over the development based on flat zoning. It allows a negotiation that's been going on that doesn't happen if someone comes in and says, I want to build an industrial park or I want to build an apartment complex.
And the reason why I keep bringing that up is because we are obligated as a city, 8,500 single-family structures today, period, without any more discussion from anyone. I just want to let everybody know that, because you keep reading stuff in the paper, you keep hearing verbiage and everything out there. We are obligated to 8,500 single-family residential homes. Thank you.
Councilwoman Orr.
Yes, Mayor, I just wanted to make the comment that in addition to all the hours that staff has put on and that we have certainly gone through and studied in meetings and outside of meetings, the Planning and Zoning Committee, I think they had almost 30 hours prior before we even were able to look at what was going on. So they put a huge amount of time in. I just wanted to recognize them in their work because
And working to 8:30 at night, I understand, a few times.
Yeah, yeah. So there's been a lot of work from everybody, but yeah.
Mayor Pro Tem.
Thank you, Mayor. Similar to Councilman Blair, I just want to share some thought process as we move forward, never losing sight of private property rights. The property's zoned. The property has a zoning that allows it to build X amount of units. A unit doesn't necessarily mean a picket fence and a dog and a cat and a couple of kids in a house. A unit could be apartments, a unit could be condos, a unit could be just about anything. So they do have the property right of somewhere in the vicinity of 14,000 units on the property the way it's zoned today. The proposal is to annex in, or to, we've already annexed it in, but the property, the 1,800 acres, has by zoning the right to build X amount. 10.5 still leaves them short of 2, and they still have the privilege, and they should not be held to not being able to build to what they're zoned for. We may not be able to supply the water for it. Nobody's obligating us by this contract to provide that water, okay? However, if they were able to go out and buy water credits, or if they were able to go out and get water, they still have the ability by zoning, by property right, to build additional homes, or apartments, or condos, or dormitories, or whatever the case would be. That would equate to 10,500 units. Just sharing that with you.
Councilman Shiska.
Thank you, Mayor. I talked on the radio this morning, and I made an analogy. And the analogy is, this is not a family planning process. We have had a baby. It's not whether we decide in the future to do this. We have the baby. We can't put it back in the oven. Now it's dependent on how we raise this child. That's up to us. And I think that we need to go forward.
Okay, it looks like we've exhausted the dais up here. We'll go to the public. You want to call the first person up?
Patty Schaefer.
Patty Schaefer, 5171 East Diamond Drive, 86301. So, been a scientist all my life, and up there's some natural law. This is NASA Goddard Institute of Space Studies, recent analysis of multi-decadal drought risk. And you can see we're virtually guaranteed that in the coming handful of decades. So to speak in terms of what we're obligated with water, I don't know, I apologize, I'm from LA, we're rude, but it seems like a fantasy. I mean, it's legal and all that kind of good stuff, but there's the facts. So we all do science in here. I mean, I've got 2 artificial joints in my body. I was saved by a medical procedure when I was a kid. Cell phones, video, the whole works. Well, here's some more of it. What I'm seeing, I could be wrong, is we're planning on what's the horizontal line labeled past up there. Where we're going is that line, the arrow I've labeled future, and that's moisture balance. So we're looking at droughts that, by the title of this paper, are unprecedented in millennia. So this is going to be an issue we're going to have to deal with. You know, I mean, I know there's laws, and there were people up here who said things like, we care about Prescott, and I believe they do. But I think this is what's driving people. I'm kind of agnostic about a master plan. It sounds like a great idea, except for that. And if you don't include that in the master plan, you're making somebody a mess for the future. Maybe an insurance policy. Because probably it'll be mostly built out by the time things get really bad. And I wonder what water credits taste like. You know, do they really quench your thirst? Do they come in flavors? So it's like, if we don't have the water, we don't have it. And you can't really see here, but on the right one, soil moisture, 2 meter, the darkest box is right over Prescott. So this didn't cut much mustard with the general back at Space and Missile Systems Center because he's in LA, Vandenberg, on the West Coast Launch Range. But it's really relevant to what you guys have to plan for the future. And I think people are jumping on this master plan thing because it's a chance to express their concerns of the future, and they're perfectly science-based concerns. This is basically all the data we have on the right there. That's why it's so fuzzy. There's hundreds of data sets in there with careful analyses. So maybe they can, maybe the master plan people can indemnify Prescott if dealing with the water becomes an overwhelming issue. Who would want to do that? Or they could renegotiate every couple of years if a sudden drought, a 35-year, by the way, is a mega drought that you were seeing were guaranteed. If something like that shows up, would they be willing to renegotiate the rate of building? But if it doesn't show up till, say, like 2080, then the houses are already there and there's no water. So how do you deal with that? I don't know, take out an insurance policy that would at least reimburse Prescott for when they have to build pipelines in? Okay,
You got 1 minute
I'm not a
left.
scientist there, so I'm done.
Okay.
But that is real. I don't know how you're going to deal with that. And I think that's what people are concerned about. Thank you.
Thank you. Try and remain seated for everybody to be able to see anything that's put up here on the screen. Who's next?
Bill Gauslow.
Bill Goslow, 720 East Willis, 86301. To start, I'd like to thank you, Harry, and you, Greg, for your service to the city. We're going to miss your counsel and your guidance.
Thank you.
I'm going to put on my designer glasses now because I've heard the term new water source tossed around here 3 or 4 times today. And I've given you some design ideas that are practical, technically feasible, and would take care of a lot of water problems in this area. Someday when you and I, Harry, cross paths at church, I'd like you to take me aside and explain how you people think, because I'm not picking up on it. Having said that, to everybody in this room, have a happy Thanksgiving.
Thank you. Who's next?
Larry Meads.
My name is Larry Meads. I live at 1504 Delilah in Prescott, 86301. And there were some concerns at one point about some of the waivers, or what I'm trying to say is that the master plan at one time did say that it was going to be exempt from various rules and regulations, and it looks like that's not the case anymore, and that was one of my concerns. I just want to ask if, I wonder if copies can be made available to us citizens, if the city could do that and maybe charge the cost to cover the cost of it, because it'd be nice to have a copy of the development agreement and the exhibits to read. Is that possible? Right, right.
The development agreement, at least the form that we went through today, prior to some of these changes, has been online for about a week on the city's website. If you go into the public records request, what was shown today it's been online for about a week. So, and it's a free document. It's electronic. You can print it out yourself. We have a 25-cent a page copy cost if somebody wants a hard copy. So my recommendation is go online and grab it.
Okay, I'll take that as a no then.
We can actually print hard copies, but we would charge you the cost of printing the hard copies.
Right, and that's
You
my
just make that
question.
request.
Is that available?
You can make that request through the planning department here.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you. All right, and again, it appears that my concern about waiving some of the rules and regulations has been addressed. I do see here where it says, I'll read this statement, future updates to the general engineering standards, but only to the extent such future updates as applied to the property do not result in an increase to the construction cost of any segment of infrastructure by more than 10%. And I just wondered what happens when it's more than 10%. What does that limit a cost to the developer? Is that the intent?
Let me clarify a couple of things. That the process that's set out in there is that it has to be, it's an engineer's estimate by the developer of materials, usually probably the type of material that's needed for the infrastructure. Then our engineers have to review and approve that cost estimate. So I think the process would be if the city were to change its engineering standards in terms of the types of material that we would require for a particular, infrastructure, a pipe material or something like that, then either if it costs more than 10%, then the city could either contribute the extra towards that extra cost, or somehow figure out a way to reduce that cost to below 10%, that 10% increase. But it's, again, I think somebody mentioned something about inflation. It's not the cost today of that infrastructure, it's the cost at the time the infrastructure is going in under the current standard versus, a revised standard. So, and again, I think the purpose of these is not to, drive up the cost of development such that it creates essentially an inability or a moratorium on development. It's to get the best product, for public infrastructure into the ground that reduces the maintenance, the long-term maintenance and operational cost to the city. So that's the whole idea behind it.
Did that answer your question?
That was clarification. I appreciate that. Yeah, thank you. And in another paragraph here on 4.1, it says, notwithstanding the foregoing, the hillside development standards contained in the code are hereby waived. Is that intended to remain in here? And what are the hillside development standards?
Mr. Mayor, for clarification, on very steep slopes in Prescott, we have some limitations on how much of those particular properties that are established can be disturbed, can be cut and fill modifications to the site. Generally speaking, it is very steep slopes, 20% slopes, steeper than 20% slopes. The property in question has few, if none, that fall into the category that trigger that requirement. So there was no need to leave that in place, given the very small areas that could be affected by that.
That answer your question?
Well, I don't understand. If there are none that are there, I don't understand why it would be specifically waived for the project. That if it's necessary under the circumstances, I would think we would want it in there for that reason. that addresses those slopes. So it didn't.
Thank-
Thank you.
Next.
Joyce Mackin. Thank you. Helene Berman.
I'm Helene Berman. My address is 3060 Timberline Road. And I have a question and just want to bring something to your attention. Whenever I see articles about traffic impact, it's always 89 and Willow Creek Road. I think we also should be looking at Willow Lake Road. That's already impacted by the basis school, and it's a mess to go back and forth on that road. So please include Willow Lake Road with the traffic impact. What I heard regarding the traffic impact, and I may be wrong, but that would be done after homes were built? Okay, please.
Just to clarify, Mayor and Council, we have the master traffic or the master infrastructure reports. As property is proposed to be specifically developed either through a site planning or subdivision process, that would then generate the requirement for a specific infrastructure report, wastewater, water, drainage, traffic, for that particular development, taking into account there's potential future development to occur. So that impact report then tells us what infrastructure needs to get built. Before the subdivision plat is approved, the impact analysis or the infrastructure report goes along with that, and that again that tells us how big the pipe needs to be, how wide the street needs to be, how many lanes, whether you need bike lanes or multimodal path or all those kinds of things. So that all gets processed as part of the subdivision plat or site plan review and approval process.
Did you want to add to that?
That's the same process we use for development now. So it's no different than our standard processes.
Okay.
Okay, thank you.
Mr. Mayor, could I address Helene?
Yeah.
Helene, you mentioned Willow Lake, and our Bike Pedestrian Traffic Committee is in fact looking at Willow Lake and Prescott Lakes Parkway and the problems that we have there with the traffic. So just want to know it's on the radar.
Okay,
Yeah.
thank you.
Thank you. Next.
Sharon Egan.
My name is Sharon Egan, and I live at 133 Bradshaw, Prescott 86303. And my questions are with regard to an opinion article written by Joe Gardner, who's on the P&Z Commission, saying that he doesn't feel that this project should move forward. And I'm wondering why you're considering doing that when he is voicing his concerns about the project, even with the reduction in the planning and zoning reduction recommendations. It doesn't sound to me like you are taking into consideration the quality of life of this community or the historic value of the community. And I know that there are business people on this council that I feel are taking into consideration their business accomplishments and the money that they'll be putting in their pocket other than what the community feels. I haven't spoken to anyone who is for this, and it is really puzzling to me why you're moving forward.
Can you explain that to her one more time, John? Please.
Well, I guess I'll address it this way, and hopefully this answers some of the questions. Mr. Gardner is on the Planning Commission. He was one of the 3 no votes. There were 4 yes votes with a number of conditions of approval. And if you want to talk about those today, I'll defer to George as to where we're at with those 21 conditions of approval. The current, again, I'll emphasize the current zoning on this property, as we see from the map, allows for something like 15,000 residential units, at least on paper. Obviously there is some reduction in when you start planning and subdividing. Again, I'll refer to or defer to George Worley, who said, is this the preferred way to develop, or is master planning the preferred way to develop? He called this flat zoning. And he said it on a number of occasions that master planning is the better way to develop large parcels of land. It not only allows us to plan the land uses, but it allows us to plan the infrastructure, the streets, trail system, large pieces of open space, parks. It also allows us to plan kind of regionally around the area, because as we know, a large parcel of land that gets developed like this doesn't have impacts just on the parcel itself. It has external impacts. So master planning allows us to then plan for those external impacts and be able to deal with those things. So it's not, I'll emphasize, it's not a question of master plan or nothing. It's not a question of whether the antelope can run free or we master plan. It's a question of, do they develop under this current zoning, or do they develop under the master plan? And I think that's pretty clear from what we heard before from some of the attorneys for the owners, is the funds that are generated by this go into the foundation, into the trust, and that's used for charitable purposes. This land is not going to sit fallow. I think that's an inaccurate
But the point I'm trying to make is, planning and zoning looks at it differently than we do. We have a legal obligation to provide that development with water.
We do.
Thank you.
Well, I know that's what you're saying, but the people of this community pay taxes and have to live here, and you need to take into consideration how they feel. Like I said...
Legally, we don't have a choice, and that's what our lawyer told us.
Well, I'm sorry, I disagree.
Okay, next.
Judith Merrill.
Deputy Clerk. We
So
got
trying
some
to get
people
your
back there.
attention.
who
Merrill,
want to continue to sign in.
1252 Sierra Peaks Drive in Prescott. I too want to thank those of you who've served for so well and the hours that you put in. And I went to the planning zoning meetings and was impressed with how much time was spent on this. I was pleased this morning or this afternoon when I came with Mayor Oberg saying that he thinks we're rushing this through. I was dismayed by Ms. Orr saying she wants to rush it through. I feel like one reason we have some of this problem is because years ago, water was given away or allocated or whatever we want to say, and now we're stuck with that. And I think more time needs to be given to this, even though it probably makes you just want to tear your hair out to hear me say that. And I hate to come to these meetings too, so I don't like saying that, but I think you need to not take a vote based on this Thanksgiving week meeting and next week's meeting coming the day after a Thanksgiving holiday. Some of us last week hoped we'd get more information about traffic and we'd get to give some input on traffic. I know very little about the traffic, and I was looking forward to audience input, and that's just gone. And unless somebody from last week is on this list, I guess I won't hear anything about the residential concerns about traffic. I too read Joe Gardner's article this morning, and I'd heard what he'd said to the Planning and Zoning Commission, and it's shocking to think that we'll be more dense than, or that area will be more dense than San Diego and more dense than Oakland, California, and some of the comparisons that he's made. And we may have to supply water to them, but I hope that there can be some way to modify this density because of the water problem and because of the traffic input. I feel like Deep Well presented a widely optimistic plan about what can be done here. And they make it sound so good. And I agree that it's better to have it planned than just have everybody go out and buy a little plot and build whatever they want to and hope that the roads work, because I feel we've got places here in Prescott where people did that, and so we've got chains across them so people can't go through and there's no flow, and and there are some major problems, but I'm asking you to just postpone this vote and let more people give input, especially about traffic and especially about water. You've had a chance to read all this, but some of us haven't had a chance to read all this, and some of us are concerned about things we don't even understand. It says there can't be any moratorium on building, and I think surely there must be a time if we run out of water that there could be a moratorium on building, but I'm not an attorney and I'm not a city planner, and I don't really understand all this, and I think as a resident I should have more chance to learn more, and I thank you.
Thank you. Let me just say that Joe Gardner has come up a couple times, and I will say he's one person with one man's opinion. So I understand that some people want to take a look at that and believe it, but I think anytime I hear something like that, I always like to hear the other side of the story too. And I apologize for the people that didn't have an opportunity to talk last time. Again, we blew it. We planned too much in that day, and I'll admit a lot of those people that signed up last time are not here today because they're already gone off to Thanksgiving, and so I apologize for not getting their input. Next, please.
Art Atona.
Mayor and Council, good afternoon. My name is Art Atona, and I live at 34 Perkins Drive in Prescott. And I'm a board member of the Antelope Hills Property Owners Association. Our board has met, and if you received the materials from the Planning and Zoning Commission, you received our president's letter, but I wanted to go on record here in this session with the same information. We've taken a position on two of the issues that you have before you. One of them is the airport, and very briefly I'll just say that we're looking to the city staff to ensure that the agreement contains adequate protections so that landings and takeoffs and safety concerns are dealt with in a way that doesn't jeopardize any of the folks in the existing development on the other side of the roadway. Because any slight deviation in how those lines are drawn on the map for takeoffs and landings could affect people on the other side of the highway. And if you didn't receive information about a gentleman who spoke at Planning and Zoning, whose name I can't remember, but he was exceedingly impressive, his background and his experience, and I think he's the president of the Aircraft Owners Association or some group there that I'm not reciting the name.
That's Ted Wickstrom.
Okay. A gentleman with tremendous credentials. Just suffice it to say that if you could hear what he said or see or read what he said, you'd be enlightened as I was, because the main point he made was it's not a question of whether there'll be a new accident out there. It's a question of when it's going to happen because of the historical number of accidents that have occurred. The second point is 89, Highway 89. It's been already commented here today that one of the main concerns is to keep the traffic on 89 flowing. And today when I went online, and it is very easy to get online and read what you have posted. When I got online and I started looking for the maps to tell me whether or not the developer was still planning to have a point of ingress and egress south of the new roundabout and north of 89A that appeared on one of the maps that we saw at Planning and Zoning, I saw that every one of the maps that's now printed shows that as a point of ingress and egress. And if you look up here, if I'm doing this backwards, this is the new roundabout. Here's 89A, and I'm sorry, this is the Perkins roundabout right here. Here's 89A, and halfway in between is a point of ingress and egress. Our board is adamantly opposed to giving the developer the option of putting in yes, that shows it well, thank you. Gives the option of putting that in. I can guarantee you, having driven in and out of Perkins every day 3 or 4 times, that the traffic now, when the traffic lights are such and the traffic volume is such, the traffic heading southbound backs up to at or past the point where the Perkins roundabout is going to be. And if you've got another traffic signal in there, we know all well how well traffic signals are coordinated with other stoppage points on the roadway. That traffic will be horrendous with another point of ingress and egress if allowed, especially even a T intersection, because your traffic flows are much different. So I'll just suffice it to say that we're opposed to any development plan that either authorizes now or authorizes in the future a new point of ingress and egress south of Perkins and north of 89A. Thank you.
I think what he was showing on the map, sir? Yes. Can you give us the map to show over there? I think the roundabout you're talking about is the one that currently goes into the golf course.
Yeah, that's Perkins. Yes.
Yeah. And so you're talking about between there and down to,
yeah. Line, he's pointing at it correctly. That's the point where new ingress and egress is proposed onto 89. And you see the roundabout north of there that is the new one at the end of Willow Creek. And then you see the dotted one, which is the Perkins one, where they're actually doing utility work now to start construction. You see how that breaks up the traffic flow significantly if that new point of ingress and egress were allowed.
So you basically would agree with a roundabout there?
Roundabouts, we wish it was coming online tomorrow. The roundabout is essential. In the prior meeting that where you had to cut short because you had other things going on and we didn't speak, I was going to mention the fact that the traffic, somebody commented that traffic is heading southbound in the morning and northbound in the afternoon. I'll buy a cup of coffee and sit on a folding chair and let anybody that wants to observe traffic. It's pretty heavy both directions in the morning and in the afternoon. And that roundabout will, and you take your life into your hands when you travel, especially southbound off of Perkins onto 89. Now, the roundabout will be a significant safety feature. We're not objecting to that. We want that. We're objecting to the other potential with the dotted line that shows the potential for a new point of ingress, and it's on all of their maps. And they did bring it up in front of planning and zoning. So we assume they're serious about wanting that eventually.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Rob Petrich.
Mr. Mayor, members of the council, my name is Rob Petrich. I'm here on behalf of the James Foundation, which is the owner of the property, not the developer. There are representatives of the developer here. But on behalf of the developer, I'd like to just address a few comments that have come up, either from the city attorney or from members of the public. First, I want to assure the council and the public that the James Foundation is a nonprofit entity. That means it can only use its assets for charitable purposes. So when you read in the development agreement that the owner is a nonprofit and uses its monies for nonprofit activities, that's 100% true. It can only use its money for charitable, scientific, and educational purposes. And that's what the James Foundation has done and will continue to do. Regarding the master plan and development agreement, there is no such thing as a perfect master plan or a perfect development agreement. The best any of us can do is work on what we've got today with the circumstances known today. And we've done that. The owners worked 10 years on this from the time that the city first came and approached the owner and said, would you be annexed into the city, your 1,800 acres? And that's only 10% of their James Ranch. And the ranch said, yes, we'll cooperate with the city and we'll allow 1,800 acres to be annexed into the city of Prescott. And they said, city said, fine, we'll zone you appropriately. The city went out and hired expert planners to zone the property, and that resulted in the existing zoning. And the city also said, here's your zoning. And the owner said, fine, thank you very much. We'll rely on that. We'll proceed and we'll work on development of the property. And we'll use any monies we get for our charitable purposes. So 10 years, this has been in process by the owner and the developer, and the city staff has worked on this for a very long time. I know the public process has just been more recent than that, but there's been a lot of work behind the backgrounds. So when you talk about where we stand in the timeline, we think the timeline is now, because if you're in a business, any business, delay costs money. Delay equals lost opportunities. We have a unique situation I've never seen in 43 years where the owner of the property, subject to a master plan, is a charitable nonprofit. So the money's generated as the developer brings down a parcel of property and develops it and pays money to the owner. That owner then is a charitable nonprofit, takes that money and goes out into the community and spends it on public purposes. I don't want to give you a long list of all the things the James Foundation has funded in this community, but it is a long list, and I think most of you are aware of what the James Foundation uses its money for. So the delay will not only hurt the owner, it'll hurt the public, because this is vacant land. It's not generating any money at all. It only generates money if the developer takes down a piece and pays the owner. So the longer this takes, all the community nonprofits in town that are being funded by the James Foundation are hurt. And the public is hurt. This master plan will stand on its own merits to this council or to the next. But in terms of cost, of delay, it's much better if this council can make a decision. Since there is no perfect master plan or development agreement, the city will be keeping a list, I guarantee you, of all changes that it wants in the future as the circumstances change. The city will be making that list and checking it twice. And so will the developer, and so will the owner. And just like any other master plan the city has ever had, or any city has ever had, there'll be a time when the parties get together and say, okay, the circumstances have changed. What can we do to improve things? And there will be amendments. An example I think that is good is Prescott Lakes. I think that's a wonderfully planned master community. I think it's been before the city council on about 5 amendments. Those things happen. That's the natural process. Regarding school lands, it's not a question of working to deal with Prescott Unified School District. This owner intends to donate very valuable land to the Prescott Unified School District. And that's not a question of making a deal, it's just an intent of the owner. Water keeps coming up. I don't think the public quite understands that this is the owner's water. The owner has this water, the owner has a private property right to use that water, and the owner will use that water to the extent possible. And when that water is completed, it can't do anything more. It has to stop. So what will restrict this development more than anything is not zoning, it's not the master plan, it's water. We all know that. So even though you see in the agreement 10,500 units, in reality, it's water that's going to control that. It'll be less than that. If anybody's lucky and there's more water, great, that's terrific.
Okay, you're over 5 minutes. You got a couple more points, or?
Yes, density under existing zoning by City of Prescott is 15,069. Under the master plan, 10,500, considerably less. Thank you.
Thank you. Next.
Jack Wiley.
Good afternoon, Council. My name is Jack Wiley. I live at 4710 Echo Canyon Place, Prescott 86301. I have 2 issues that have been expressed here also. One is water, and I respect Mr. Blair's statement that there is so much water available to this property, so therefore it can be developed in any way. My question is how is that water allotment decided? How does one come about to define how much acre feet water is available for development? Because, you know, there's, in this newspaper article, you can see all the developments that are north and east of this area. And they're all scheduled for multi-development residences. And I think it's from that perspective that we get the article from the paper about 89A and Ms. Orr's statement as to the amount of volume that is going to come down through that area as a result of the development. So the water is one issue. Those that are thinking about the Big Chino pumping plan, I lived in Cottonwood, Arizona for about 19 years, and I've seen that whole scenario occur with SRP, and the computer model of what the water, if the Big Chino were pumped, what would happen to the Verde River, which resulted in SRP waging a lawsuit against the two cities, and that being negotiated in 2012 for a study to be done concerning the pumping of the Big Chino. And I've read nothing about that study since then, but even in the article it said that it would be before 2022 before there could be any action taken for that pipeline, if the studies were agreeable. The other issue is the infrastructure. A lot of this deep well project is going to empty into 89. I live right off of Granite Dells. I can tell you right now, between 8 and 9 o'clock, there is no ingress or egress out of our street. It's impossible. You can ask any of the officers that patrol that area. It is just car after car after car after car. You develop these areas, and how are these people from 89A going to get into Prescott? They're either going to come up 89 or they're going to come up Willow. And there's no other access. And you can try and widen the road or put in a traffic circle as you did in front of the Phippen Museum, but you have some huge rocks there to prevent any widening of the road. It is a 2-lane road. So that's another issue I have, and I think the council should take into consideration before building so much north and east. Thank you.
Thank you. And City Manager, I think one of the things we're looking with that traffic study is for them to recommend, other connectors, arterials, if it's possible. Is that?
Sure. If we do the North Prescott comprehensive traffic study that involves surrounding jurisdictions and potentially the developers, we're going to look at all those issues.
Yeah. And Leslie, you want to just take a moment? Basically, we allocate water to various residences based on history and.
It's based on state law, so we are within the guidelines of state law. We have a decision and order of assured water supply. The city took all their supplies into the state, and they have to be physically, legally, and continually available for 100 years. And then we go in and modify as required by the document.
But we also did a study to see exactly what usage homes had, and we based our.
Right, and that is a component of the portfolio when we look at the alternative water supplies that we spoke about last time and probably many times before, is that we looked at how the community was using the water supplies. And so there was a unit allocation change to reflect how this community uses water.
And where do we stand right now on the study for the Big Chino? It's year 4 or 5 out of 8, or?
Yes, sir. The best place for information is I keep the city's website up to date. Show the pathway to those who are interested. It has all the legal documents that are associated with that, maps to show where things would be happening, as well as an announcement section when we have something new that comes before council, a contract, the model, you name it. That's where I keep it all up to date.
Okay. Thanks, Leslie. Councilman Blair?
Thank you. Leslie, don't go away. I only know enough about water to be dangerous, so I'll take that danger plunge right now. Is the Deep Well Ranch water alternate water or assured water?
Well, let's say it's both. The city only has one assured water supply, and that's what our portfolio is. Everybody has an assured water supply. Within that portfolio of assured water supply are different categories of water based on state law. So there's groundwater supplies, They're alternative supplies, and if we move to your question directly, the deep well water is coming out of that alternative block,
Okay, now,
assured water.
with that said, is the Deep Well Ranch have a 100-year water supply from ADWR?
Well, yes, it comes out of our portfolio that the state has reviewed.
Okay,
In
so
accordance with all state laws.
my point is the state's well aware of what we're doing based upon documentation. They've authorized it along with the city of Prescott, correct?
They've authorized the volume that the city has within their portfolio.
Thank you.
Thank you. Next.
Leslie Hoy.
Leslie Hoy, 1880 Coyote Road. Mostly I just have some questions, but with regard to moving this along before everything is done, there are still conflicts between the master plan and inside the different sections, which is understandable because it's so complicated, and those conflicts are what makes lawsuits later on. So unless the Deep Well Ranch wishes to pledge that they'll pay all the cost of the lawsuits that could arise later on, then I would say we better clean it up a little bit more. One section, poor Mr. Palladini's falling asleep over there. Who can blame him? Or maybe he was just thinking deeply. Yes.
Waiting for you to say something.
Oh, okay. Section, touche. Section 2.2, which you covered, the regulation of development. It's one huge paragraph, and it's so hard to understand what it really says. And I'm wondering if that could be rewritten so it would specifically state who's going to do what without all the legal language. And specifically, if the city creates a new code or modifies an existing code after the agreement is signed, does the modified code apply to the Deep Well Ranch?
If you look at Mayor Council, Section 2.2, the definition of governing requirements are the city code, rules, regulations, policies, development standards, general engineering standards, and other development guidelines will apply to the development of the property. Those are referred to as the rules. And the agreement and the zoning, which is the master plan, will modify any conflicting rules as specifically set forth in either the master plan or the development or this development agreement. And we went through that. So those rules, as modified, are referred to as the governing requirements. Those governing requirements also include all future city ordinances including any amendments to the general engineering standards that are agreed to by an owner. Remember, this property is going to have probably a number of different owners that will end up developing the property. There also include any future amendments to the city code that don't conflict with or vary from the agreement or the zoning. So in other words, all of our police power authority we retain to regulate health, safety, and welfare, that are, so long as they're uniform and non-discriminatory, which is, sort of defines how we adopt code amendments. All future city ordinances, rules, regulations necessary to comply with state or federal law. So to the extent that, let's say, ADEQ says you must adopt some type of rule or regulation for environmental purposes, that would then apply to the development, or the EPA or something like that. all updates to the building code, so amendments to the building code or any other health safety code, like the fire code, would apply. So like I said before, if buildings are built, in the next 2 years or 3 years, and then our international building code is, we adopt the amendments to that, then all of those amendments would apply to any future building going forward. Remember, we don't apply that retroactively, just like my house isn't subject to meeting the current building code, unless I do a remodel of some sort. And then the engineering standards, even if the owner doesn't agree, as long as they don't increase the cost of that infrastructure by 10%, that also applies. And then any imposition of tax, fees, those kinds of things apply across the board. So basically what we're saying is all of the rules and regulations in place apply to governing this property unless they're specifically amended in the master plan or in this development agreement. And that development agreement, those are basically those development standards that are set forth in Exhibit F that the Public Works and Community Development Department have signed off on as acceptable modifications. So the whole intent of that is to give a certain amount of stability and reliance to the development as part of master planning, so that things can be planned without having changes done that would then potentially change the way the master plan works. So I apologize if it looks complicated, but that's just the way it's written. I mean, you could break it out into double spacing, I suppose, and make it easier to read.
John, no offense to all attorneys present here, but it has to be legalese to mitigate possible future lawsuits. So you got to have that wording.
In essence, the way this is written actually makes it clearer than trying to sort of simplify language, because if you just use sort of generic, simpler terms, it becomes more vague, and vagueness is what really leads to litigation in contracts. The more detail you have, the more specific you are, the less likely you are to actually have disputes and disagreements. Just for the record, I didn't point this out before, but there is a process in the development agreement that deals with that provides for a process to deal with disagreements prior to litigating. So there's essentially sort of an arbitration kind of process, mediation arbitration process that's in the agreement. So the intent of obviously the parties is to avoid litigation. Litigation is expensive, and obviously when we do these kinds of agreements, the intent is to avoid if we have a disagreement. The idea is to work that out as efficiently and cost effectively as possible.
So, if the city creates a new code or modifies an existing code after the development agreement is signed, the answer to does this modified code apply to deep well is maybe.
It depends.
Okay, it depends. Okay, I guess I got this. I got the answer. Wait, okay, I had some questions in recitals.
Don't forget, we're giving you 5 minutes. I know he took a lot of your time, so.
Okay, you can tell me when my time is up. On page 2 of the recital, section J, there's a sentence that says, the owners in the city acknowledge that the ultimate development of the property within the city is a project of such size, scope, and quality that owners require assurances from the city that the owners have the right to complete the development of the property pursuant to the governing requirements before it will expend substantial efforts and costs in the development of the property. Who is it? Is it the city or the owners?
The owner.
The owners? Okay, I think it would be good to replace it with the owners, so that would be clear. Then on page 3.
They've agreed to do that.
Okay, thank you. Page 3, K. At the bottom of that paragraph, it says the city is willing to use good faith efforts to facilitate the utilization of various public and/or quasi-public financing methods as may be provided in future amendments to this agreement. What exactly is the city promising to do there?
Say what page again?
It's page 3. It's in the recitals. It's item K.
Your flashlight.
I'm good. So, that basically says the city would look at creating a community facilities district.
Oh, okay.
Again, it's recital, so it doesn't get into specifics, but that's really what that's talking about, is that we'll reasonably contemplate analyzing whether a community facilities district would be applicable or appropriate for development of infrastructure on the property.
Okay, thank you. And that leads to probably my last question. Years ago, between 10 and 15, when we went through the last crazy building period, I did quite a lot of research on community facilities districts because those were brought up as potential financing. And my research showed, and I think Prescott Valley's experienced this, community facilities districts work well when the development is proceeding at a pace enough to pay for the infrastructure. But if there's a recession or development falls off, then there isn't enough money in the facilities district to pay. And then what happens is there's already some homes built in that district, but so what happens to the infrastructure? Well, what usually happens is that the city is forced to take it over because there's those poor homeowners out there inside the city with no way to complete or manage the infrastructure. So I guess I just want to warn that we're in a good period now. There's a lot of building now, but things happen, especially over the next 40 years. So community facilities districts might not be such a hot idea. Okay. Thank you all for all your work on this, and thank you especially Mayor Olberg for extending the period to consider the agreement. I really appreciate it.
Okay, thanks. Mayor Pro Tem, did you have a comment?
Yeah, I wanted to call Leslie back up. Tried to get to you before you sat down, but it didn't work out too good.
Yes, sir.
Wrong Leslie.
Oh, Leslie Grazer. Okay.
All good. High five.
Thank you very much. Going back to the train of thought that Blair was on,
Yes, sir.
and we were talking about assured water, and we were talking about alternative water. As we live, breathe, and speak today, Prescott has legal authority to extract how much water out of the ground?
The portfolio is about 24,000 acre feet.
Thank you. And how much are we on an annual basis extracting?
Last year's water withdrawal report was probably about 6,500.
Thank you. The idea that we're short of water is just, it's absurd. The reality is that there may be a shortage of water in the state, but it's not Prescott who has the legal authority to do certain things, who have chosen wisely to manage our water differently than some of the other parts of the state. So I just kind of wanted to go back to that, and you report and communicate with ADWR, Arizona Department of Water Resources, how frequently?
Well, by state law, we have to report every year all the water movements in the city. So whether it's from the recharge facility, off the reservoirs, pumped and delivered to homes.
So we're managed, along with ourselves, we're managed by the state significantly.
Yes, sir. The 1980 Groundwater Management Act.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Leslie. Next.
Peter Krupnik.
Thank you, Mayor and Council. Peter Krupnik, 2457 Desert Willow. I'd like to start with a question from last week, if I may catch up. Councilwoman Wilcox asked, how much is the Big Chino pipeline going to cost us? The estimates that I've seen going forward, now not the historical ones, are about $200 million. Factor that in with the turmoil caused by the city to meet our public retirement fund growing interest. If we add interest to that $200 million, over 30 or 40 years, we're talking about $400 million. We only need half of that. PV will pick up around the other half. Where are we going to get $200 million? Now, if we throw in all the infrastructure, if I understand Mr. Palladini correctly, we've got to put in water and sewer infrastructure for the deep well ranch. That has to go in first before thousands of houses are built. How are we going to finance that? If I understood him, we're going to bond that and be paying the interest until we get enough houses there to start paying that back.
You know, Mayor Pro Tem, I can respond. First of all the infrastructure inside the 1,800 acres is paid for by the developer, whether it's done out of the developer's pocket by way of CFD or some other, financing mechanism. The internal, infrastructure, streets, roads, water, sewer, was all built by the developer. The two maps I showed you, as well as external streets, are funded to the extent necessitated by the development by primarily impact fees. So oftentimes our construction is done on a pay-as-you-go basis. Versus borrowing, because we do have rates and our way our rates and fees are set up, it can go and pay for certain pieces and parts of infrastructure. So never say anything about borrowing. Oftentimes public infrastructure is built on a pay-as-you-go basis. But again, all of that money is all of that external infrastructure, to the extent needed by or necessitated by the development, is paid for by the development primarily through a tool of development impact fees.
Thank you, John. Did you get that answer?
That's okay.
Okay, it's growth pays for growth. So
Growth,
when you
that's
say
what-
we are going to pay for this, well, we happens to be the people that are creating the cost. That's who the we is.
That's good. Okay, I want to make sure of that. Now, just to come back to water for a minute, if we were to impose landscape regulations on this development such that there was no external use of water. Ms. Grazer has shown us in the past that there's a substantial amount of our water is wasted on grass and other outdoor waterings. We would not need the Big Chino pipeline. Between the Prop 400 that returns water to our water treatment system and the water saved from eliminating outdoor use. From my mind, that's easy to do. We simply go back to planning department and say, no external water faucets. Crushed granite outside. Yeah, you can get colored crushed granite.
That's beautiful.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Krupnik.
Daniel Matson.
Left the building. Elvis has left the building.
Okay. The last one I have is Bill Feldmeyer.
Oh, boy. Okay, Mr. Bill, you're on stage.
Mr. Bill.
That would be me. Thank you. Appreciate the opportunity to be here, Mayor, Council. Bill Feldmeyer, 434 South Alarcon. I got here a little late, so I sat out in the hallway and watched my own personal TV screen with another lady, Connie Cantelmi. And I really planned on just listening until I heard the lady who got up and left because she was mad say that she's never talked to anybody who was in favor of this. Well, I really wanted to introduce myself to her because we must travel in different circles. There are numerous people that I've talked to who've been in this community for decades, like myself, that are in support of this project and have been since its beginning. I must tell you that during the time I've been listening to these to these conversations, I've heard, even from opposition folks, legitimate questions. But they have been followed every time by legitimate answers to those questions. But what we also keep hearing is people who really want to delay. They want to delay, 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 delay. Well, you know, and we all know that this dog has already been beat to death. It's been going on for 10 plus years. Maybe we didn't read about it in the paper for 10 years, but I've known about it for 10 years. And it was the city who realized the importance of annexing that ground into the city and offering that for long-term planning via a master plan to the current owner, the Deep Well Ranch. So I don't want you to delay, delay, delay. The dog's dead already. Let's vote, vote, vote. And I hope that's done next week.
Hey, Bill, can I respond to you for a minute?
Yes, sir.
You know, I appreciate you standing in front, not accusing me of being a thief or being corrupt, simply because I chose to serve my community, along with my fellow council, and sit up here and listen to some of the accusations that I'm in the pocket of a developer. And I find that very offensive. I wish Ms. Egan was still here, because I would tell her, you're offensive to call me corrupt, because I respect private property rights, I respect the law, and I respect the governances that I swore to uphold, which includes the Constitution and those rights that come to a private property owner through the Constitution of the state of Arizona and that of the federal government. So thanks for not calling me a crook.
Well, I couldn't, because I've been called a crook when I was sitting up in my dais years ago for the same reason, upholding the exact same sentiments that you hold close to your heart. So let's move on. Let's give this private property owner the opportunity to develop the property and reinvest in our community at the same time. Thank you.
Councilman Shiska.
Thank you, Mayor. I wasn't going to say this, but I have to. I happened to be witness to a conversation at a coffee house with a bunch of ladies, and they were all very, very nice ladies, and they happened to be talking about the hospital and the deep well, so I kind of inserted myself in the conversation. And one lady was saying, well, I think we should delay so that the next council has an opportunity to vote on this. And I asked her why, and she gave me a couple of answers, and I said, so do you mean you want to punish the developer? And she thought for a second and said, yes. So I think that people need to look way down deep and say, why am I really objecting to this? Am I objecting to it because I really want it to be done right? Or am I objecting to it because I just don't want it to happen, and I want to delay it as long as possible? And I have to tell you that's not getting us anywhere. Like I said, this baby's already been born. We can't put it back. I think we need to do the raising of the baby right. So I strongly would suggest to take a look and say, why am I really objecting to this project?
Councilwoman Orr.
Thank you, Mayor. I just wanted to, address Judith. And Judith, your question, you said that I was in favor of rushing. But I've been on the council now for 2 years, and believe me, we don't rush. We have been very thoughtful with this. Lots of study, and this was actually in our general plan that was voted on 2 years ago, overwhelmingly approved by the citizens, and so this is not rushing. I believe that this is living up to the responsibility that we have, as Mr. Lamerson, Mayor Pro Tem, just said. And again, I'd just like to remind folks that we're talking about a piece of land here that's about 18,000 acres, and they're developing 10% of that will help maintain the rest of the acreage. So I think that's just really, that says something about this, and I just think it's so important that the master plan is is certainly in my head, in my study, the master plan is definitely the way to go. And I agree with Mr. Feldmeyer. I think it's time to move ahead so that we can move ahead and we can, in fact, do what we need to do for traffic. And we get the groups together because, as Steve said, Shiska, this baby's been had. So let's raise it the right way and let's do the right thing for Prescott. So I just wanted to address that, Judith. Believe me, I just don't feel that we're rushing at all.
Last week, we didn't have a chance to comment, so I think that's pushing it ahead quickly, if you don't like the word rushing. I think this was, we keep hearing, this has been settled, this has been settled, this has been settled, but a lot of us haven't seen that. You have seen that, and some of us haven't seen that because it hasn't been published, it's not because we're not trying to see it. So in that sense, I think you're rushing from decisions that you've made to publication to a final vote. And I defend my word.
Thank you.
Who's next?
That's it.
That's it. Okay, good. Well, out of all the people that raised your hands and said you needed to read it, because there's about 300 pages have been added yesterday and today, how many people do you think will get it done by next Tuesday? How many people do you think it would take longer than that? You know, that's the point that I'm getting at. You know, we represent the public. The public feels that they don't have time to read this thoroughly before the 28th because it is voluminous, number one. It's complex, number two. Number three, we got a major holiday sitting up next to us, and we can talk all day about, you know, time is money, but I can tell you what, this type of development down in Phoenix would take 2 years. We got this in July, and we moved along pretty good on it. And I think we're making very good progress. And I think another month or two is not going to kill us. I think it's very appropriate to make sure that the public has an opportunity to read all the documents and be able to have their input. And, you know, I appreciate Bill back there and other people saying that, you know, this is a dead dog. Maybe you understand it 100%. Maybe you read everything, Bill, and my hat's off to you because I haven't had a chance to read it all. I can tell you that. And I'm not going to vote yes on this until I read everything. So I think we're ready to conclude this thing, and we've already got 2.5 hours into this study session. So is there any other comments from the council? Okay, thank you. This meeting's adjourned.